times it can be hard to take something you love when you were young and give it a critical assessment, but it can also be quite fun and a good learning experience as far as getting to the roots of your personal preferences. I've already done a video of this type before, but this time I want to dig even deeper and look at a game I can vividly remember playing on not just my parents' PC, but most of my other relatives too. You know something goes way back when you first experienced it on your grandma's computer. The game that you've been watching up until now is Tank Racer, released in March of '99 for the PC and PS1. While I grew up with the PC version, for the purposes of this video I have no problem playing the PlayStation release, since unlike, for example, another childhood classic, Colin McRae Rally 2.0, the differences are so minimal that it really wouldn't be worth the hassle of installing an ancient executable. Before we can get into the mechanics, let's just take a second to acknowledge the premise here. This is a game about racing tanks, machines that were never meant to move quickly. Yet, through the power of creative liberties, this is a concept that can absolutely work when the right elements are mixed together. Unlike a lot of vehicular combat games, track memorization and solid driving are at the core of the experience, with the weapons adding an extra bit of flavor and unpredictability to the competition. The driving model, while not realistic in the slightest, isn't a Mario Kart or CTR clone, nor is it in the Gran Turismo world. The tank sits somewhere in between, where they understeer enough to convey the sense of weight you would expect from a war machine, but the physics let you get away with wall grinding and rapid swerving. As these are contraptions meant for combat, that turret on top isn't just for show. Using the L2 and R2 buttons, you can rotate it independently of your steering and just straight up shoot your opponents. You'd probably think such a mechanic would be cumbersome in practice. Thanks to the blocky hitboxes, very little precision is actually required. If there's any one system that sets Tank Racer apart, it's definitely this one. Though this is where opinions might be split on its implementation and what it adds to the experience. One could definitely argue that a little more depth to the turret and its projectile's behavior could have made for an even stronger mechanical identity. However, I believe that its simplicity is what allows it to stay out of the way of the core racing experience. I find that an overemphasis on the combat part of combat racers is what I find turns me off of most games within the genre. If I wanted straight up combat, I'd just play a fighting game. Your arsenal isn't limited to just a standard shot. You've also got an assortment of offensive and defensive items, but unlike the Big M, they won't make or break your race. Most of them are just variations on the basic projectile, some with a bigger blast radius, others have homing properties, you got different kinds of landmines, and the obligatory boost and shield. The most effective weapon is easily the UFO, which teleports your opponent to who knows where and guarantees moving up a position. Besides that, there's no blue shell equivalent or anything that has the potential to end a race, so Tank Racer ends up being a much more skill-based game. That focus on driving ability is further solidified by how the opponent AI is handled. Due to the size of the tanks and the narrow width of the tracks, there's no traditional grid start, and instead the racers start out separated from each other. Think Ridge Racer or Need for Speed Tree in high stakes. This obviously means that you're gonna have to spend almost the entire race catching up to first, but to stack the odds further against you, there seems to be no rubber banding to speak of. Keep in mind I'm not super great at noticing this sort of stuff, but let's just say if you lose a few positions, you're not getting them back quickly. Honestly, the game can be extremely unforgiving for what's marketed as a simple family-friendly racer, although back then that was pretty much the norm. Something I was definitely not expecting from a game like this was the distinction between the different tanks. Let's be honest, unless you're a die-hard car nut, you probably don't notice the tiny little differences between cars in most racing games, apart from the stuff that's super pronounced, like acceleration and steering. Tank Racer, of all things, actually does a pretty good job of making what are essentially reskins of the same tank model actually feel different. Seriously, if you find yourself struggling on a certain track, I recommend you try a different tank, as its steering response and speed to acceleration ratio might be better suited for it. Going back to what I said about the track width, the overall design of the courses is a blend of narrow sections and more open areas, tied together with thematic set pieces. This is kind of bleeding over into the presentation, but I really do have to compliment the track variety and art assets. There are at least two memorable and standout moments in each track, usually playing into the given theme. There's field getting carpet bombed, there's a hockey rink, a giant plastic shark, or a Russian bank, the list goes on. And none of it is just for show either. The ice is actually slippery, and not to mention the mud also affects your handling in the swamp area, and the bombs can in fact hit you. There's also a slight element of environmental interactivity. You're driving a tank after all, so naturally you're going to be able to flatten certain objects or destroy parts of the set dressing. For PS1 and a budget racing game of all things, this is pretty cool and adds both a greater sense of presence to your tank and the world around it. Let's just pretend that was my segue into looking at Tank Racer's on-track presentation, and all nostalgia aside, I'd say it holds up for the most part. The developers made the right call of not trying to compete with contemporaries such as Midtown Madness, Revolt, or High Stakes. and instead leaned into what the PS1 and lesser PC hardware of the time could still do relatively well: simplicity and stylization. Just by looking at the tanks, you can tell they were not going for realism and chose to give everything this very distinct paper mache look to it. Nothing is overly detailed in its geometry, and even at 240p, everything has a very clear silhouette, which makes for far better playability. That's not to say the tracks are void of any and all detail. You're gonna notice stuff like particle and weather effects, the aforementioned destructible set dressing, and the subtle shading on the tank's texture. On the whole, this game has a very complete sort of look to it, if you get what I mean. Nothing looks like it's obviously supposed to be there but missing due to hardware restraints. Even the render distance is pretty good. While the racing is lively and energetic, the menus act as the cooldown in between. You've got these really simple patterns with shifting gradients underneath and some simple buttons. I guess it's pretty cool that you can change the background, and I really love the particles that appear when you type in your initials after a race. This low-key presentation is complemented by an absolutely gorgeous drum and bass track. It's literally only 2 chords, but the intricate sine wave arrangement on top creates a beautiful atmosphere that makes me nostalgic, even having never heard this track before since the PC version didn't play the music for whatever reason. Take a listen. As for the music that plays during the races, it's your typical late 90s almond break laden hardcore type stuff. Honestly, it's not super memorable, but it fits the action well, so I can't complain. The overall soundscape is fittingly mechanical and punchy, with your tank's tracks taking up most of the mix. Your basic projectiles don't sound too powerful, but that was probably intentional to bring more attention to the more impactful weapons. My only real gripe is that I wish the boost had a more distinct sound, as it only has this rising bit of noise when you activate it, but not while it's in effect. Alright, I've assessed the gameplay, visual, and audio presentation of one of my childhood favorite games. Now is that part of the video where I decide whether or not it's actually worth going back to 24 years later, or if it should just stay a memory. Well, despite trying my absolute hardest to be all critical and disregard the rose tint, I actually can't find much to objectively criticize as far as execution goes. The game feel is good, the concept is unique, the presentation is remarkably polished for its time, and my only real gameplay related critique is the difficulty, which you could argue is actually beneficial since it plays into that classic arcade game sensibility of not a lot of content, but it takes time and skill to see it all. I was almost hoping for this review to end up being negative, since I feel like the current outcome will look as if it's been tainted by sentimental value, despite the fact that I've looked at the game as critically as I feel an obscure PS1 budget racer should be. Basically, TLDR, this game is genuinely a good time, and its premise and structure has kept it much fresher than a lot of other gimmick racers at the time. Well, there I go again, contradicting myself, since in my Tony Hawk video I said I don't typically do traditional game reviews, but since Tank Racer is certainly not as widely discussed as some other games from this era, I think I can indulge a little bit. Thanks a ton for the support once again, and I'll see you in the next one.